But now we need to talk about Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who was a KGB, a mid-rank KGB thug, who claims never really to have believed in the communist claptrap that he was putting out, which wouldn't make him unique among the Soviet apparatchiki, but who nevertheless obviously imbibed a sense of Soviet patriotism and some kind of belief in aspects of that ideology, and has certainly accepted the Soviet theory that the world is out to get Russia. The NATO expansion was about giving the West a buffer from the threat that it had just managed to drive off of vast Soviet mechanized armies in the heart of Europe, poised to overrun all of the West. So there was absolutely a security thing. NATO is a security alliance, and the big part of this was gaining a buffer for the West so that Europe could actually have peace and develop peacefully and without fear, which the threat of Soviet invasion throughout the Cold War had denied it. But in addition to that, the NATO accession was also meant to help bring those Warsaw Pact states and then the Baltic states into compliance with NATO standards, which is not just about military stuff. It's also about legal, moral, ethical frameworks, about how we fight wars, about how we treat our soldiers, about how the military interacts with the civilian population. It was meant to be part of an effort that was successful to help those countries develop healthy democracies and healthy free market economies. And we invested
and the capacity for some autonomous function at the national level, or for full autonomous function at the national level.
Right, complete,
right, so
we don't control them, right.
So you're laying out an argument essentially that claims that to view this as a duopoly, let's say it's the US and its satellites against Russia and its satellites, that's a profound misapprehension of the historical reality, because it wasn't Russia and its satellites, it was the Soviet Union, which was a bloc, and it's America with its allies. So America sits as first among equals, let's say, something like that, in a voluntary organization that's predicated on the preservation of freedom at the political level and at the economic level. And if we want evidence for that, we look at the response of the wall in Berlin, for example, to take not the least of the examples, but the crushing of Hungary and Czechoslovakia and almost Poland when the Soviet Union did fall, and look at the response to any manifestation of genuine autonomy on the part of the Soviets. So, okay, well, we still have a question that's lurking constantly in the background. It's like, why in the world would the Russians are prone to reject an invitation to become part of the sovereign voluntary association of Western states? For some reason, they distrust the West. We've talked about that. They regard themselves as having an autonomous destiny, but hypothetically, that could have still happened. So let's take a slightly different tack. Let's imagine we're trying to figure out, what did we do wrong in negotiating with the Russians in the last 20 years, and what did the Russians do wrong in conceptualizing themselves and in negotiating with us? So let's start with us, maybe. Like, we're in this situation.
Well, hang on. Before we do that, there's a sea change that happens in Russia when Putin takes power, because Yeltsin had been one thing, and then Putin is something else entirely. And Putin had become an anti-communist in the 1990s, and he helped Yeltsin fight off the attempts of the communists to regain power. And initially, I think, by the way, Putin identified himself as a Democrat and someone who was in favor of democracy, which worked for him as long as he was actually winning elections, handily and didn't have to rig them. And he didn't have to rig the first few elections very much, and he could allow them to be relatively free because he was popular. But it's Putin who brought a new approach to this. And it's Putin who brought a real sense of grievance and anger. And the grievance was about the fall from greatness of the Soviet Union. Now, the one thing that it is necessary to have in people's minds here, the 1990s was a horrific time for Russians. Okay. I want to set aside the question of our responsibility or what we did or couldn't have done, because the truth is, I will assert, and I would be happy to argue with anybody about that. This wasn't our fault, and there wasn't much we could have done about it, frankly, anyway.
Are you talking about the 90s specifically,
about the 90s,
or about what's?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
About
Well,
the
yeah,
90s.
the 90s were a catastrophe. My son-in-law, former son-in-law, was Russian, and he said often when he went to school, him and his close relatives who were also attending school weren't necessarily sure they were going to come home alive through much of the early 90s.
It was crazy. I was there in 1995 doing research in the Russian archives, and the ruble dropped from 3,000 to the dollar to 5,000 to the dollar in the 5 weeks that I was there doing research. One time, it was absolute. I went to the first McDonald's on Tverskaya Square as it opened, and it was an amazing thing. So I saw a little bit. I mean, I was standing around. There were guards with AK-47s guarding vegetable markets as I would walk by them. Why was that going on? Because everybody was getting cuts and their rival gangs were controlling every aspect of it. And it was completely insane. It was a horrible period for Russians to live through. And it was an unbelievable humiliation for someone like Putin, who believes in Russia, that Russia should be one of the world's two superpowers, to have gone through that experience. So Yeltsin tried to lead his country through that with its democracy intact, and he succeeded until Putin destroyed it. Yeltsin was never able to fix the economy, really. So Putin comes in with a deep sense of grievance and burning with humiliation at what had happened to the Russians in the 90s. And he needed an explanation that came readily to hand for why that had happened. And on the one hand, he blamed Gorbachev for surrendering instead of fighting. And he bitterly resents the fact that Gorbachev didn't kill as many millions of people as he needed to just to stay in power. But he also blamed the West in many respects, mostly unfairly, honestly, for Russia's humiliation. And then we had a narrative rapidly emerge in the early Putin years that not only had the West contributed to Russia's humiliation in this way and mistreated Russia in various ways in the 90s, but now the West was trying to prevent Russia, as he kept saying, from rising from its knees. And that the West was trying to keep Russia down. And he began to elaborate a series of narratives which attributed all kinds of malevolence and, frankly, much more thinking and coherence in Western policies than has ever existed in them to us, and also made the mistake that most humans make of solipsism, of imagining that he was at the center of everybody's thought and that everything that we were doing in the world was aimed at Russia in some way. And so he created this narrative, which he has been pumping into the Russian population ever since,